Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And we'll just give a bit of time for everyone just to come in from the lobby and just get settled in their place. So we'll just give it another moment to get everyone to join. So I think that's probably everyone in from the lobby. Hard to tell, but the machine has stopped beeping, so that's really good news. So a warm welcome to all of you joining us today on Teams and to our panelists. So we're very lucky to have some experts with us today to talk about the root causes, looking at behaviour. So we're here to talk about behaviour and the unmet needs that children may have experienced, and then how this links to the behaviours you might see at school. But before we get started, let's just take a moment to introduce the panel. So I'm just going to go first, just say my name is Rachel Houlden. I'm the MD of Flourish, and for the last 13, 14 years, I've had the joy and privilege of working with colleagues and associate trainers to provide face-to-face and online training in education. We also work in adults and children social care as well, so working with foster carers who work with vulnerable children. But we've delivered training to hundreds of educational settings, so mainly at the attachment and trauma space, but looking at how unmet practical and emotional needs shape learning, attendance and relationships in schools, and thinking about the root causes of those behaviours. So very much along the theme of this webinar. So I'm delighted you can join today, because it's key to us looking at what every adult can do to make a difference to all the children in schools. And if you can understand trauma and the impact of early childhood experiences, what a difference that can make in the way we have relationships with children in school and interact with them. So enough about me, over to introduce the panel. So first of all, I'm going to pass to Maureen, if you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Hi there. Thank you very much for the invite for tonight. My name's Maureen McKenna. I'm based up in Glasgow, a very wet Glasgow, I hasten to add. And I'm a secondary maths teacher to trade. But prior to my retirement in 2022, I was the Director of Education in Glasgow. And prior to that, I was an HMI schools inspector. So a lot of the work I've been doing since I've retired, I do little bits and pieces, has really been around that promoting inclusion. And most of the work that I've been doing has been down south. And in particular, I worked with London's Violence Reduction Unit, but I'm also on their inclusion charter, but I'm also doing work with some local authorities, helping them think about that strategic approach to improving behaviour. And the stuff that we're all wrestling with in schools is around attendance as well, and that sense of belonging for young people. So delighted to be here tonight.
Thank you, Maureen. I've just realised I should also share my screen, so my apologies that I should have done that before. So I'm just going to share my screen and then over to you, Charlotte, if that's okay, to tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, thank you for having me. So my name's Charlotte Barton. I'm the Managing Director of Progress Schools. So we are a collection of 13 schools registered as independent, although we're predominantly what you would see as alternative provision. So I myself have worked in the sector for over 20 years. So I've started as an unqualified tutor, gone all the way through as a teacher. I'm a qualified Senko with a Masters in Educational Leadership. And interesting listening to the work Maureen's done more strategically. Obviously, a lot of my role focuses on what that looks like operationally on the ground.
Thanks, Charlotte. And finally to Suus-anna, please.
Thank you. And again, thank you for having me. I'm very quick to say I'm not an expert, but I have spent 20-something years in education, predominantly in SEMH. I trained as a teacher. I still am a teacher at heart, but a lot of my work has been supporting schools, local authorities, advisory services, thinking specifically around the SEMH needs of our children and young people. My doctorate is in resilience in education, and so really trying to understand how we can support our children, our young people, holistically, individually, systemically. I work for a virtual school. I train as part of the Flourish team, as well as Nurture UK. And so we've had some overlap with the work Maureen was talking about with the BRU as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Suus-anna. And I think modesty there's some extraordinary experience on the panel we've got today, so we're really lucky to have you. So thank you for joining us, and we can't wait to hear your insights on what we're going to be talking about today. And for those of you on Teams, thank you for joining us. We know how precious your time is, so we'll get cracking. So as we go along, please do put questions in the chat. So Lucia from Flourish is going to be collating them to ask at the end. So please do add comments if you would like to as we go through. Okay, so today we are going to look at how unmet needs can drive behaviours. So the research in this area often cites this as a key driver of behaviour in schools. And so what we're going to do is have a look at a number of questions and just open the floor to the panel to discuss. So the first question is, what are some of the most common unmet needs that show up as behavioural challenges in schools? And if it's okay, I'm going to come to Charlotte first for that question.
Of course. Lucia asked us to keep this around patterns and themes. So I think one of the first things that's really a term that everybody will understand, especially in the education sector, is that persistent disruptive behaviour. I actually have a post-it up on my wall in front of me because we try to reframe that as consistent emotional dysregulation. And I think that is a summary of what we're seeing. So whatever the type of behaviour, it is a form of communication, but it all leads to that emotional regulation, primarily through unmet social, emotional or communication needs.
Lovely, thank you, Charlotte. And Suus-anna.
I think one of the things that we see that impacts on behaviour is for our children and young people maybe struggling with relationships with adults, maybe a mistrust for adults. Within education, there's the assumption that our children and young people should trust us because we are safe, but their early experiences of adults may not tell them that. So I think there is a piece of work around understanding that trust has to be built, and I think sometimes when our children are struggling to build those relationships with adults, it leads to perhaps a misunderstanding of what it is they're trying to communicate or what it is that's happening for them at that point in time.
Yeah, of course. So behaviour is communication, and actually that we assume that all adults are safe spaces, don't we? And sadly, that's not the experience of some of our young people. So yeah, thank you for that. And Maureen, over to you.
Thank you. I think we also can't forget about the curriculum and the unmet needs that a lot of the behaviour challenges that our children are expressing is because they are feeling a barrier to learning. And that barrier to learning might take a whole range of forms. And so it might be that the curriculum that's being offered to them doesn't suit their learning style. And it is a real challenge for our teachers, isn't it, in classrooms to try to meet that range of additional support needs. So in Scotland, we call it additional support needs as opposed to special educational needs. And I think England has to think about the terminology that we're using, because special educational needs is a deficit model, isn't it? It tells us that there's something missing from a child that we need to, as adults, fill up in some way, when actually their additional support need may be a lifelong need. And so therefore we need to think as teachers how we reduce those barriers. And if we don't reduce those barriers, then that's when the behaviour starts to flare up, doesn't it? And some of it is born out of frustration from the child. And that communication, is that communication, what's that communication about? Is it trauma at home? Is it a barrier to learning? And that makes the joy of the craft of teaching, as well as making it quite a complex task. So I think we do have to think very deeply about unmet needs and think about ways that we can work collectively to reduce those barriers to a child's learning in order that they can build those relationships, in order that they can feel that sense of belonging in their schools.
And of course, that's one of the challenges, isn't it? When you've got a whole school, you've got a whole class in front of you, all with varying needs. And how do you meet the needs of those individual children and build relations with each one of them? And that is no easy task. But you're right, if a child is struggling to access the curriculum, then actually that's going to put them in a state of dysregulation, which is going to come out in behaviours. So thank you for that. So let's move on to look at the impact of behaviour in schools today. So we know that retention of teachers across the sector is a very significant challenge. In a recent survey that we've just got on the screen there, teachers were asked why they were considering leaving the profession and why. And one of the top three concerns was the impact of behaviour, the stress on the well-being of the teacher, on the other pupils within the class, but also on the days lost or the hours lost of teaching, dealing with behavioural issues. And that was alongside the other concerns of workload and leadership, which of course you'll be familiar with, I'm sure, on this call. And it's not just on the staff within the school setting, it's also on the children. So school days, many school days are lost due to suspensions, exclusions and absences, and we know that's a trend which is on the increase, which is why it's so important that we understand some of the root causes of this behaviour and look at how we might be able to support some of the young people so that they can access the curriculum and hopefully enjoy being at school and therefore their learning. So our second question is, what are some of the challenges around changing attitude and approaches towards behaviour? And if it's okay, I'm going to come to Suus-anna for that one.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is a really big question, and I think there are lots of ways to consider this. But I think one of the things for me is the idea of looking after our staff. Working in education, teaching is incredibly rewarding, and it can be very rewarding, and supporting some of our most vulnerable pupils can be really rewarding, but it can also be really difficult because sometimes our children are bringing really complex lives into school, which we are then supporting them with. So I think there is something about how we support our staff. For me, something around supervision, and we are still a profession where it's not mandatory to have some sort of supervision. It's, you know, it does happen in terms of practice, but teaching and working in education isn't a case of kind of as simple as teaching and learning. I stand at the front, I deliver something, and you absorb it. Those people in front of us, those young people in front of us, are, you know, a build-up of their environment and the experiences they're having, and we can't ignore that. That is who is in front of us. So I think for our staff, it's really having the time to understand what some of our children's experiences have been, why it might impact on them in the way it does, thinking about those different levels, those different systems around our children, and how they interact. At the moment, internationally, nationally, locally, globally, there's so much going on that our children are seeing. They're, you know, absorbing the news, they're seeing the images, they're seeing kind of this different approach to people depending on their backgrounds or who they are as a person, and that does impact, and therefore that will also impact on their ability to learn, to engage. Perhaps they are quite anxious about what they're seeing. So the curriculum then, as Maureen was saying, isn't always a priority. I heard a young person speaking recently who had been groomed for criminal exploitation, and he said he wished the adults he was working with essentially understood him in the way he was trying to be understood. I think there's a disconnect between what we might see as adults and what our young people are trying to communicate. And I think that space has to be held for our staff to be able to say, that was really difficult. What could I have done? How could I understand it? What might I have missed? And to have those conversations, I think, is really important for our staff.
Thanks, Suus-anna. And that reflective practice, you're right, as the increasing complexity of our pupils and the young people that are coming into classrooms, the complexity of the needs that you're seeing every day in the classroom is only increasing. And it's interesting, isn't it, that if you're a foster care or a social worker or a psychotherapist or somebody working, you would have supervision, absolutely, that would help you process some of the experiences that you're dealing with secondhand through the children, but also to support in how you might reflect back on practice and perhaps do things in a different way next time, or in fact in exactly the same way. So yeah, it's a really interesting difference across the professions working with the more vulnerable children in society. So may I come to Maureen next, please?
Sure, thank you. And I notice in the chat somebody quite rightly has highlighted the challenges of parents and parental attitudes and the additional stress that sometimes those influences that parents have. And I suppose it's the word behaviour. I'm for a maths teacher, I'm pretty focused on ironically on language and the power of words. But when we use behaviour in an education context, it's always about poor behaviour, isn't it? Isn't that what we think? But actually, behaviour is all kinds of behaviours. And perhaps we need to be changing that word about relationships and to talk about relationships much more than behaviour and relational work in general in our schools, to try to see our children as an asset, not as a barrier. I can remember, when I was teaching in school and in those in-service days and the excitement amongst the staff, and you say, my goodness, if only every day was like this, how much work would we get done when there's no children here? But actually, we have to work with our families. And one of the things we did in Glasgow a lot was to try to open our doors to allow families to come in, to get families to come over the doorstep, to be included within our school. Because as teachers, we're not very good at talking to parents. We're a wee bit judgmental, we're a wee bit dictatorial, and the language that we use isn't always the best when talking with parents. So we need to think about that, because if we don't have our families on side, then they will build walls that will be about those changing attitudes and approaches towards behaviour, where they'll just defend their child to the hilt, and it causes more stress and more anxiety on our staff. So let's think about the language that we're using, and sometimes that can be a real challenge for our staff, because our staff are under pressure. If you're in a secondary school, you're jumping from class to class. You've maybe got 6 different groups of young people are coming through. In the primary school, you're having to deal with that breadth of curriculum across a day and to get that integrated learning through. And I do feel a little bit saddened about the emphasis on schemes of work that I see in primary schools down south. Where is the creativity and the craft of the teacher coming in to bring that joy, to be able to respond to the different children, the different needs in a classroom? And I think that there's so many challenges, but let's think about the positive aspects of our work and how we can build on those positive aspects. So having families part and parcel of our school life, having positive, thinking about what children can do, not what they can't do.
It's a lovely way of turning that around, isn't it, and reframing that in our minds. And I think one of the interesting things about parents is actually they may not have had a positive experience of school themselves, and therefore they bring that baggage into school when they're talking about their own child. And so actually they might come in a slightly more defensive way than perhaps somebody who's had more positive experience of school. So you've got to get over that barrier as well when working with the parents. So so that's interesting. Thank you, Maureen. Charlotte.
Thank you. And I think just to pick up on the point you made, Rachel, somebody's put in the comments there about it's that fragility with the families as well, and often their mental health and resilience, and they are role models to the children that we're then facing. And so many amazing comments from my colleagues, and sort of picking apart those bits and adding my own to it. And going back to what Suus-anna said about our team, and I think if we go back to the question in hand around changing attitudes and approaches, your team culture is so huge. And I think anybody who's worked in a small provision, alternative provision, knows that that team is your bond, your rock. And if we go right back to the beginning where we talked about how these young people need trusting adults, and we have to present that every day without fail. So it has to start with our team's mental health. And a point earlier, we talk about behaviour as only negative, but we do the same with mental health. How often do you hear the term good mental health? We automatically say mental health and we all think it's negative. So putting that into the positive, and but the culture, the well-being leading into the supervision that Suus-anna mentioned, that has to be a starting point, and that change the attitude, because it's where you get inconsistency across your teams as well, that you don't see the results that you necessarily want, or the students and the young people don't feel that trust and consistency in what they're receiving. But I think that then leads to the second prong for me, which is also about that our education system is so compliance based right now. We're such in a high regulated environment that we feel like that has to take priority, because otherwise we'll get a poor Ofsted grade, we'll get a poor quality assurance visit, or we might get a bad performance review when we're teachers or a member of staff. And actually, when we're unsure, we will default to compliance. So when we find difficulty in behaviours or presenting behaviours or communication from young people, it feels a natural progression to default to behaviour management over behaviour understanding. And I think if we can make sure that all of our teams have got that resilience and well-being to increase their expectations around it, so that what is trauma informed for one is for all, because for another teacher that might be somebody's low expectations if they're comparing it against a compliance-based model. So it has to start with that well-being and the solidity of your culture in your team.
Yeah, and it's interesting trying to move the school shift from a more behavioural style of behaviour management to that more relational style of behaviour management. And actually, that does, in the experience we've had working in schools, have some resistance, because teachers sometimes there's a worry it might lead on to poor outcomes. So I don't know if you've got any experience of that. So let's have a little thing now about how trauma might show up in the classroom. So a significant number of the training sessions we do deliver look at trauma and early experiences of children in the classroom, and then how those experiences may show up in the classroom as behaviour. And so the research shows that children who display behaviours they may challenge in the classroom, they've often had early childhood experiences of trauma and unmet needs, be they practical or emotional, and that shows in behaviour, as we've discussed a little bit so far. So question number 3 is: what are some of the ways trauma and adversity might show up in a classroom setting that teachers often overlook? And Maureen, if I could come to you first this time, please.
Thanks very much. I suppose it's hard, isn't it, for teachers? It's hard for teachers and all staff in schools to fully understand what might be happening in a child's life. And when you've got that pressure of, the thought of Ofsted round the corner, or that breadth of curriculum that you have to offer in the primary school, or, oh my goodness, they've all got to pass their exams, it can be so easy to lose sight of the child, of other people's children that are sitting in front of you. And I think in Glasgow, that's what we spent, a huge amount talking about our children. These are our children, and the importance of us owning them and not wanting to pass them on to somebody else because they needed to have that sense of belonging with us, and using so some of that trauma and adversity that a child experiences that the teacher just hasn't thought about because of all the other things that are going on in their head. And we do have to manage our teachers and consider their well-being, and really think about how we can scaffold their understanding of how children learn. So that investing in your staff is just so important, and investing in them, again, and again and again, and in just in the same way that we do with a child's learning, where we teach a concept, then we reinforce, then we reinforce, then we build it up, then we, teach the next concept, and we go back and we reinforce, and you have that cycle going. So as leaders in our schools, we need to do the same for our teachers around trauma and adversity, so that they understand what that child may be coming to school with. And we need to think about it in ways that are simple. I'm not up for going down a medical model. And that can be a huge problem, is that we push a medical model onto our staff, who just then feel a little bit overwhelmed by everything that's coming. I mean, I like to think a lot of our children in the city experience poverty. They experience poverty, disadvantage, and trauma through that poverty and disadvantage. And when they come to school in the morning, they have little backpacks on, and quite often those backpacks are empty. They're empty of experiences like being taken to the swimming, like being taken to the park, like going to the theatre, or going to a museum. And so it's for us to fill that little backpack. And we can't always fill it up to the very top. But we can work really hard to fill that little backpack, and to understand that actually that empty backpack needs to be filled with positive experiences. And, there's a really good advert on the television about children in the care system, where they talk about the backpack full of bricks of what children are carrying around with them. And so, yeah, I mean, that's another good visual picture, isn't it, to understand. But let's not blame our teachers. Let's look at ourselves first as to what we can do better in order to support our teachers, because good teachers, happy teachers, create happy learners too.
Absolutely. And we come a slide a little bit later on, actually, Maureen, about the training, and how it's not something that we necessarily train and equip our school staff, and in quite the way we do. So yeah, so hopefully there's a few insights as part of this session, and as the conversations happen around these topics, that we share good ideas and see if we can develop new ways of working together. So absolutely, that's great. So Charlotte, I come to you next.
Yeah, I think for starters, I haven't yet worked with a colleague or a teacher specifically who isn't the best placed person to identify a shift in a child's behaviour. And I think we sometimes underestimate how much our teachers know. I know I can walk into any schools and our teachers will be able to tell me everything about that child. But it's ensuring they've got the capacity to pick up the patterns and trends, or as they change, for that young person to help identify. We're often dealing with quite out there behaviour where it's quite obvious. And I think it's the perfectionism and the compliance and those smaller, subtler shifts that when you're busy running around, because we know how busy the sector is, they're the small shifts that can probably go unnoticed the most, and not through want of trying. It's just that there is so much, and it's ensuring our staff have the capacity. I think one thing that's really prevalent that we do see in the sector as well, and this leads back to our staff and our culture and wellbeing, is that control-seeking behaviour. And this is where across my career I've seen the most power struggles between staff and students. And actually, I think it's the adults' moment to actually be able to take a breath and say, this is the child trying to create predictability by controlling the situation, predominantly because they've probably had a lot of instability in their life. So I think we do need to have capacity, but the ones that sort of tend to present a lot for me that cause the most concern are those quieter shifts. Hypervigilance, for example, what we might say look as distraction is probably a child constantly scanning a space looking for the nearest exit. And they're the things I think when you actually start to break down behaviours and look at it, and not just go, oh, they were faffing around, looking all over the place, couldn't concentrate. Stop and ask ourselves, why are they doing that? Why does that child feel the need to be looking everywhere? There will be that root cause somewhere, and we need that time and headspace to be able to unpick it.
Yeah, and that's the challenge, isn't it? It's the capacity, which is really hard, isn't it? But especially when day to day you're responding to so much within the classroom. So yes, it is a significant challenge. Thank you, Charlotte. And finally, over to Suus-anna.
Yeah, I think kind of coming off the back of that a little bit, the idea of those conversations you hear sometimes where something has happened, a situation escalated, and you hear staff say, but there was no trigger. And that phrasing of there was no trigger is something that certainly I talk to staff about moving away from, because then we make this connection that there must have been one thing that would have happened. But actually, for some of our children, our young people who are experiencing challenges, adversity, they're already very full. They are full of stressors, and that one thing of you're late, your tie isn't straight, you haven't got your ruler, those things that can be that last thing that they can cope with that morning. And I think trying to see that rather than one behaviour that seems to have escalated out of nowhere is quite difficult, but it does help us to understand maybe some of the responses we see from our children. We start thinking about their nervous systems, how they are when they arrive, what is happening for them already. Are they already bubbling and full? Actually, perhaps there are opportunities to get in early before we're having these conversations or these situations that have escalated. I think it's really difficult because it's not a trajectory, it's not tick box, it's not linear. It's going to look very different for children at different stages and different times for them. But I think linked to that, I suppose, is the recognition that when children have experienced trauma or they are living in situations that are impacting on their well-being, that does have an impact on their development from a child development perspective, from brain development. And so sometimes perhaps staff maybe make an assumption that because a child is 12, they should be acting like a 12-year-old. Well, actually, perhaps developmentally, in terms of their experiences, they haven't had what they need to be that age. So it's understanding maybe some of the barriers, the interruptions, and being able to address those so that those children and young people have the skills that they need to manage some of the challenges that are in school, because school can feel pretty overwhelming, for lots of children lots of the time. But if you haven't got the foundations, if you haven't had those experiences, it can be much more difficult, and they're the things you don't always see, so can be easily overlooked.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point on the age-related experience of behaviour, isn't it? That so a child may not be presenting as a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old, and actually their behaviour might be of a much younger child because of their early life experiences. And it's been able to, it's having the capacity, as you said, Charlotte, to be able to spot that root cause in some of the behaviour you may see in the classroom. So thank you, Susanna. That's very helpful, because for some of our children it's what happened on the way to school that day, isn't it? So and for some children, not having a pencil case or not having their ruler, actually getting to school was really quite a challenge for them just to be in school. So thank you all for that. Okay, if we move on a little bit now, because we're going to look at some practical strategies. So the key for all of the training that we deliver with Flourish is looking at practical strategies, because obviously it's fabulous to hear about the research that's been undertaken and how brain development is impacted by early childhood experiences. But of course, everyone wants to know practically, what does this mean day to day in the school? So what can you do tomorrow when you go into the classroom? And I think, as Maureen said, the training that is sometimes given to teachers, we don't always look at behaviour. In a recent report, it was 27% recalling that they looked at behaviour management in training. And so it's something that we need to try and equip our teachers with those knowledge, and anyone working within the school setting. And so what advice would our panel give? So let's have a look at the next question. So what practical changes have you seen? What practical changes have you seen have the most impact on behaviour in educational settings. So some practical strategies that can be implemented. Over to you, Charlotte, for this one first.
Sort of having a little laugh there because I've tried many and failed at some and been successful in others. I think I'd go back to my point, persistent, consistent, trusting relationships. So whatever strategy that you want to try and improve or you think you put in place, it's only as good as the team that are implementing it effectively. And I think that's a fundamental point for anything. Sorry, Literally, I'm going to lend into a question that's coming as well, because it sort of does lead into this response, which is around are restorative approaches better than punitive, and do they improve behaviour and attitudes? And I think it leads nicely into this, because yes, however, I think there's a caveat to that our young people still crave structure and routine and predictability to help balance their lives. So I think it's about a behavioural approach, as opposed to just members of staff picking and choosing when they apply sanctions and when they don't. It has to follow that persistent and consistent effort that everybody's got. However, yes, I do believe that restorative approaches are much more beneficial, because if we think about what we were just talking about, that there's that tiny little sanction that could just be the straw that broke the camel's back that morning, and they will absolutely have an off the chart reaction. But if you take a moment to go, well, that was a bit out of character for the request, what's going on, you tend to find that it will dig a bit deeper. And I highly recommend anyone doing a bit of a mind reset with staff sometimes, because it is easy to just get caught in the trenches of your role. You're busy, you're teaching, you're educating, there's a million and one things to do every day. And I've done an exercise in the past where we put out a scenario and we basically said, this happened, how do you deal with it? And the instant response from everyone was very compliance-based. Well, they're breaching the uniform policy, they're breaching this, they're breaching that. And then we reissued the exact same scenario, but from the child's point of view. And it gave that context around how they hadn't slept all night. They've got a baby sister. Their mother is very stressed. They didn't have any breakfast. And everyone suddenly went, oh, I feel really bad now. And actually, how could we have addressed this by giving that child some food when they come in the morning, understanding that family dynamic and going, there's a newborn in the house with a struggling single parent. And I think it's quite important just to reset our own brains every now and then. We're busy grown-ups and adults, but I think actually setting that tone and reminding ourselves why we do it, because we all come into this role for a very specific reason, and we stay in this sector because we care fundamentally at the end of the day. And I think sometimes it's really important to give ourselves that reset and remind ourselves of that, and not get tied up in the compliance policy approach.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember the why, isn't it? So sometimes pausing, and therein lies the challenge, is having a moment to pause, but to remember the why. And so, yeah, thank you for that, Charlotte. So Suus-anna.
Again, really big questions. And I think there are probably two things that I would want to draw out of this, perhaps. Really understanding what our goal or our aim is from the response that we give. So if we are going down that a more punitive route, let's say, what is the goal or the aim? How are we teaching our children and young people something different? Because that is our role. And so are we able to achieve them doing something differently, or being able to be understood differently, or to respond in a different way? Are we offering that opportunity for them, or is it a sticking plaster that is, well, this is what our policy says, therefore you need to do that, and that actually it doesn't progress much further than that? I mean, I sometimes reflect on myself as an adult in situations as well, and think, if I was in a meeting and I maybe spoke slightly out of turn, or I responded in a way that wasn't normal for my response, would I want to see my line manager putting my name up a chart to say, well, don't do that again? I don't think that is necessarily going to have the intended, their intentions. It's going to make me feel much worse about myself, and we can't shame children into changing their behaviour. So I think there is really something about being very clear about our goals and our aims in the approaches that we use, and are we offering a chance for a child to learn to do something differently, or for them to be understood and to say, okay, the behaviour, this bit wasn't okay, but I'm here, I get it, I'm going to help you, we're going to work on this. For me, there is no option there, because the latter is going to have a better outcome more often. I think the other thing is, really, we've talked about it a lot, but ensuring that our young people feel that they do belong. And that's not a fluffy, vague word. It is about ensuring that children and young people have access to things that are of interest to them, a curriculum that is relevant to them, that they are represented in the staff groups that work with them, in their peers. It's much more than, you know, a few values that we talk about. It's that feeling, that connection to the adults, to their peers, to the things that we are teaching them. And you know, ensuring that, I think Maureen was talking about this earlier, actually, that the curriculum is relevant for them. So belonging is quite a big thing, but I think ultimately that's going to have a huge impact on some of our children that perhaps at the moment are sitting on that periphery of, I don't, you know, I fit here because I've got the uniform, but I'm not sure I belong here.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, that sense of the values, isn't it? Because, you know, in the corporate world, you can have them up on the wall and you can have lovely posters about what our values are and what they all mean. But unless you live those, you can live those values, and actually you see that in practice, in this case in the classroom or within the school setting, the children know that they're words rather than actions, and it's so important that those children see the adults around them, going back to what Charlotte said, the consistency, the trust, building those relationships with our young people so that they know we're there, albeit with the boundaries around them, because there is acceptable behaviour and not in the classroom, but equally that they know there's that relationship, and then the dialogue, like you say, Suus-anna, in order to unpack what they've with the behaviour that you might have seen in the classroom. So is there anything else you'd like to add on those practical strategies, to follow up on what anyone else has said? Because that's obviously quite a key bit to take from this.
Do you want me to come in here?
Yeah, please do,
Rachel.
Maureen.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk all day about this. You know, in Glasgow, a number of years ago, you know, we set ourselves an ambition to be a nurturing city, and we used nurture because we had a long history of using nurture groups and nurture classes. But it became apparent to me that nurture classes on their own weren't any good, because they had to be high quality, and they weren't always high quality. Sometimes it was, you know, the teacher in charge had been put there because she couldn't manage a class of 25 or 30, and they felt she could just take that small group. So we had to introduce quality assurance. There was 143 primary schools, so we were really doing it at scale, and 30 secondary schools. And so we had to have that emphasis on quality, but we had to invest in our staff, and we had to invest in our staff so that all staff understood children, and all staff understood their responsibility, so that children who were displaying social and emotional difficulties were not always hived off somewhere to somebody very clever who could manage it. Actually, it's all our responsibility. One of the things that bugs me the most when I go into schools down south is that you have a depute who has responsibility for behaviour. Why? So I've gone into various schools and said, so what do you do if behaviour's on your remit? What do you do? Does that mean that you go around the school and manage all the behaviour? And they have difficulty articulating exactly what that role is. But actually, we're sending a message that that's one promoted person, when it's all our responsibilities, isn't it? It's for all of us to do our little bit in order to create that positive culture and ethos, because that's what it all boils down to. And you know, Rachel, you said about the values, they must be lived. You know, you must be able to walk the talk, and your staff must live the values. So how do we help our staff live the values? So you can do that. One of the nice things that I've seen is little bookmarks So little bookmarks. So let's stop doing posters on the wall. Can't stand them. Can't stand posters on the wall, thinking that if you put them up there, children will A, read them, and B, understand them. And also, if you put the poster up, you think that's for the children. Well, it's not. Actually, it's our staff that need to change. It's the adults that need to change, not the children. And so little bookmarks in their planners with what the value is and what the value means, and then practicing ways in which you can introduce love, if that's one of your values, into your everyday discussion. So, you know, the behaviour, the uniform policy, well, it's nice to have, but actually it's remember we all agreed. Remember we discussed this and we agreed that we would do our best around school uniform. You know, we need to get past these compliance that, you know, that Charlotte spoke about, the regulatory compliance that sits in our schools. Children don't fit into nice, neat boxes like that. And this isn't about being soft and fluffy, and it's not about getting rid of rules, because we all need rules. Society needs rules to live by, but they also need to be able to flex. You need to be able to flex them to be responsive to children and young people. And so instead of throwing them out, and where are you throwing them out back to? You know, the suspensions south of the border are completely out of order. There's just no defence of them. No defence of them at all. Where are you putting those children? What are the messages that you are sending to children? So we need to think about how our adults respond, and we need to help them. So little bookmarks can do it, having that culture and ethos, living the values, and investing in high quality learning and teaching. Because at the end of the day, that's why we came into schools, isn't it? To be teachers, to be able to deliver high quality learning and teaching. So let's not talk about behaviour management all the time. When I started in Glasgow, I didn't talk about I'm going to reduce all the suspensions and we're going to stop them. I talked about improving educational outcomes for each and every child. The ones that are standing on the street corner, I needed them in school. To get them into school, I needed to provide a bit more flex around the curriculum. So once we got them into school, they had to have something that was meaningful. They had to have that trusted adult in their life, and they had to have a culture and ethos that welcomed them, that fed them in the morning, that made sure that they were warm and made sure there was a safe place for them to be. We have lost to a certain extent that school is the safest place for a child to be, that we need other adults' eyes on them, and that what we lost in the pandemic, we need to bring back. And it is about looking after and caring for our children, because those serious cases that happen is because as adults, we've lost sight of the child, and we need to keep an eye on them and make those brave decisions. So invest in your staff, think about the adults changing, and help them, but get your culture and ethos right. Because if you get that culture and ethos and you are persistent, as Charlotte said, persistent and consistent around your trusting relationships, it does make a difference, and it raises attainment. It improves educational outcomes. And that's all I really bring is that evidence that you can do it. Takes time. Don't expect it to happen overnight, but my goodness, you can change children's lives amazingly.
Thank you, Maureen. I feel quite inspired by that. I feel I should give you a little bit of a round of applause and a sort of thank you. So the passion comes through and it's joyous, and it is true. It's all of us who make a difference in every interaction that we have with the young people. It's not one person, a leader or a department head or whatever. It's everybody. So that can really make the difference and change the life of a young person. So yes, I feel very inspired now. So so it's all brilliant, and it's touched a little bit actually on the impact, in that it's consistency. We need to get, and it's not always the quickest. Now, we talk about a lot about impact in education, don't we? What's the impact? How can we measure results? How can we see what we're doing? And so the evidence suggests that actually moving towards a sort of attachment aware, trauma-based way of working is has benefits to achieving educational outcomes, but alongside the behaviour. And so I'm just going to move this one slide, sorry. So here's, we've got the Rees Centre at Oxford University, which many of you will know, report that 97% of head teachers at schools who received attachment and trauma training to become trauma-informed and attachment-aware saw an increase in engagement, and 92% felt this had a positive impact on learning outcomes. And this is about the investing in staff, isn't it? So if we can invest in staff and the teams that we work with, then we then see hopefully the improvements in behaviour and then the positive impact on learning outcomes. Children feel like they belong within our schools, and find schools a safe place to be, and learn to trust the adults around them, which is ultimately a joy. So if we move to our final question, when schools start to understand young people's behaviour, what kinds of outcomes can they expect, and how long will it take? A multi-million-dollar question. So Suus-anna, if I can come to you first, please.
Yeah, that is the question, isn't it? And if we could box it up, then that would be brilliant. I suppose a big thing around this is you can have brilliant people doing brilliant things in pockets, and that will still have a huge impact for smaller groups of children. Or you can say, as an organisation, as a setting, as a local authority, now, you know, we are really driving this. And when it is consistent, when it is everybody, when it is lived and breathed as a culture, you will start to see that much more quickly if we're seeing all staff involved than if it's through pockets. I think staff, you know, the job satisfaction, we want to enjoy our jobs, we want to love our jobs, and I think a lot of people go into education, then for those rather that leave, it's not often about the children, it's about everything else that comes that stops them from doing the work that they want to do. So I think the outcomes, if we really start to focus on this systemically, holistically, we start to really think about the language that we use, the narratives that we create about our children, about our families, because, you know, there can be that level of judgment. I think we start to see staff enjoying their roles more and having, you know, a bit of autonomy to do what they need to do in their classroom. We will see engagement in learning or increased motivation in learning. And again, if we think back to that curriculum aspect, are we teaching the children things that are relevant, that are appropriate, that are connected to them? If we start to think about that, then we'll see that, you know, that impact on learning. Anything where we're focusing on a relational approach, we're going to see eventually those improvements in relationships, which includes our families. It can be amongst staff, it can be between the staff and the adults. How long will it take? Maureen might be better placed to answer that on scale. I think this for me really is about how much of a priority, how much of this is driven by the leaders of the system, whether that be the school or the local authority. I think if it's a real genuine priority, then I think we can start to see things being embedded, maybe incrementally, you know, in small steps, but then it becomes part of the approach, not something that we're trying, doesn't quite work, and we get rid of it because that delays things.
Thank you, Suus-anna. I'll come to Maureen with your so nicely led in by Suus-anna about your experience about changing a whole sort of country. Tell about your experiences
not
there.
Not a country. Yeah, I mean, it does raise attainment. You know, I mean, without a doubt, and you know, broader achievement. I mean, we have the ability in Scotland to be able to flex the curriculum, and I think that ability is in England. It's just not always grasped as often as it might be, about that planning to meet children's needs. But you know, we do have to think carefully about young people and children and young people. And tonight, you know, we have kept rightly, I think, the focus on investing in our staff. But we also haven't talked about listening to children and young people and the importance of listening to them about their life in school and what works for them. I mean, do we systematically gather the views of children and then act on it? I know lots of them will have pupil councils and student councils and things, but are they deciding where the bins go in the playground? Or are they being asked about learning and teaching? Are they being asked about the schemes of work that use the poetry? Is the poetry that's being offered to them, does that match their cultural expectations, their needs? Can they relate to it directly? I mean, English isn't my forte, but Macbeth doesn't really suit many people. If it doesn't matter, if you don't understand where all that came from. So it's got a place, but actually, are we matching, are we thinking about what our children need and are we listening to them? And that's the same around the rules. We tend to write rules that are from the adults, aren't they? They're what the adults write. But actually, what works for children? Are there things out there that we can use to help us move the school along from where you are? So I like rights respecting schools, for example, UNICEF, it's the right of a child to be in school, to receive an inclusive education. That's, if you're not looking at Rights Respecting Schools Awards, I would suggest you look at the UNICEF website and have a wee look at it. Obviously, the Flourish training is obviously there too, to look at, to invest in your staff. But let's include our children in it and listen to the views of children, because it's their outcomes that we want to improve. So it will raise attainment. You'll broaden their achievement. You'll improve their experiences. And if they are behaving better and responding better in a school setting, then they will in a community setting too. So eventually you should see a reduction in youth crime. So in Glasgow, we reduced suspensions over more than a decade by 93%, but we also reduced youth crime by over 50%. We used to be paying for 20 young people to be in secure care every year at any given time. Now it's 1 or 2. Yeah, it takes time. But in a school setting, you can do it across a 2 to 3 year period if you are persistent and consistent and predictable about it. And you keep reflecting and thinking how you can do this better. But listen to your children, listen to them and include them in your planning.
Lovely. Thank you, Maureen. And just shows the difference you can have on a wider community base as well, doesn't it? So quite extraordinary, the benefits you saw across the whole community there. Charlotte, just over to you.
Both of my colleagues have sort of summed it up. I think, to be really open and honest, there's that historical teacher in me that wants to answer this question, or wants to hear the answer to this question of do X and it will be fixed by Y. And I'm sure a few people on the call are thinking, please just tell me what to do and then it'll all change. But then the too long in the tooth educator has given me that experience that there is no answer to that, because as we've said earlier, children don't fit in little boxes. So what works for one group of children may not work for the next, and you have to be adaptive and flexible while being sort of predictable in the same mode. Maureen talked earlier about bending and flexing rules. Doesn't mean we take away that structure, but actually we might have to adapt for the individuals. And I think one thing I really proud, we obviously operate in an alternative provision sector, and actually we've started to rename that as appropriate provision, because I think that captures that we're going to do what's right for the child. And we have to almost, as educators, follow the rules in the compliance-based system, but also be bold and brave enough to step away from what society views as a child being successful in education. Because for me, especially when we're often working with young people who've been through that mainstream sector and have been permanently excluded, it's not necessarily about them walking away with 9 GCSEs. It's about them walking away with a skill set and a resilience that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. They can then choose to apply that to further study down the line. But yeah, they're the things that are really important to me. And Suus-anna said it's things will take time. I have seen small wins take effect when it's consistently done in as little as 3 weeks, but the larger, broader whole school culture thing will take longer time. But it is really important to celebrate those successes along the way. It's so easy to think we're not at the end goal yet, it's not perfect yet, but actually if one child did something different because of something you've put in place and started to behave in a way that said that's impacting them, we should be pulling out the bunting and celebrating and eating cake, because it's what matters for that child. It's a big thing about cake in education. I don't know if anybody else feels that. And I think the key thing we haven't talked about here is that, myself and my colleagues did the other day, this is about our limitations as well as educators. We cannot control at the moment, and I know we try our hardest, and I watch people do it and give blood, sweat and tears. We can't control the things that are also still out there affecting our young people, such as poverty, starvation, and how they come into our schools in the morning. So I think those adaptations we do, giving them breakfast, sitting them down, asking them how their weekend went, to judge and assess whether they've had that felt love and connection across the weekend. Are they in that mindset to come in and actually be part of your community in the right mind? And if not, how do we sort of jump on that straight away and say, okay, let's balance you out again?
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you, Charlotte. About celebrating those small wins, those successes, because you're right, we need it because we don't have the capacity to change the world, but we can change it for an individual child and make a difference every day in the way we have those relationships with children. And I love the idea of appropriate provision. It comes back to that language, doesn't it? And making it a more positive way of framing this to our children. So they're an appropriate provision rather than alternative provision. So I love that. That's brilliant. So I'm very conscious we're running slightly over time. Lucia, I'm happy, panelist, are you happy just to take 5 minutes of questions just to see if that's okay? Understandable. I know people on this may need to go, but the recording will continue if you want to come back and watch this last segment. Are you okay if we just do 5 minutes on questions? Is that okay? Lucia, over to you.
Yes. So we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A from Graham. So the first one, I do think has been sort of answered by this webinar, but I suppose it might be nice to sort of have a little summary. So it says, using a restorative approach rather than punitive improves behaviour and attitudes. Thoughts?
Great.
Yeah. Yes.
I think we've covered that one. And then this one is less of a question and more of a comment, but it is interesting to think. So it says, for the majority of students, suspensions don't work. It's about the student not making the same mistake again. Students understand trust and respect, and this involves liaising with parents and all the professionals involved in that with that student. And I suppose looking at sort of, if we're talking about hopefully sort of the future in these restorative approaches and then maybe the more traditional approaches, how do those approaches fit into the picture?
Do you want me to come in there, Rachel?
Thank you, Maureen.
Yeah, I mean, so the argument around suspensions, I would agree they don't necessarily work. However, they are necessary at times. If you can't, if for the safety of the child or for the safety of other children, there may be a time when you need to suspend, and we shouldn't shy away from it. I'm never going to argue for 0 suspensions. I would make a pretty strong argument around 0 permanent exclusions, actually, on using the legislation to permanently exclude, really because of the impact on the family and the trauma that causes often to a family who is probably pretty fragile already. I think we can support our families to make better choices about their child's education when those relationships break down. So there should always be that need for suspensions. But in Glasgow, there's 73,000 children in our schools. And last year, and I've been away for 3 years, there was 635 suspensions. That was it, out of those 73,000 children. And, so suspensions still happen, but 80% of those, they're suspended only once. And if there's multiple suspensions, then you need to ask yourself, what am I doing wrong if that child is continuously being suspended? And so we do need that kind of continuum of provision. And, somebody's put in, internal suspensions should be used. But what is an internal suspension? I visited a school in England, and they were very proud about how positive they were and the notices all over the walls and that kind of thing. And then I said, where do you put the children when they're being a bit naughty? Because there's always a place, isn't there? There's always some little dark hole. So off we went, and they showed me with great gusto this room where they'd obviously decided that sensory deprivation was the answer. So they put black curtains on all the walls, and then the desks were in serried ranks, and then the grumpiest looking teacher would sit in the corner to supervise. And I was thinking, but what are you doing? I mean, where are you supporting that child to reflect on their behaviour, to be able to move towards something more positive? We really have to think a little bit better about that, don't we? So, and I'm back to language. Internal suspension, not sure. Pupil support basis, not sure. It has to be something a lot smarter, doesn't it? That's focused on the needs of that child and what that child might want at the same time. So I don't have a precise answer. Okay, internal with restorative approach, yeah. Movement breaks, things like that, yeah. There's not a straightforward answer to it.
If anyone's got any brilliant ideas, please do let us know. And anything that they use really positively within their school environment, we'd love to hear, because it's all about sharing that best practice. So thank you. Lucia, is there any other questions? Is there anything else to just add on?
No, it was just those.
That's brilliant. So thank you. Apologies for slightly overrunning, but thank you ever so much for our panel for insights today and sharing all of your huge amount of knowledge. I've absolutely felt inspired and learnt an awful lot, and I appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And for all of you who are on Teams, thank you for giving up your valuable time at the end of a school day. I know probably you're all exhausted and just want a cup of tea and a biscuit. So I'm really grateful that you could join us today, and we hope you found this valuable. And please do give us some feedback about anything we should change, any future conversations which you would find helpful. But that's it from us. Just have a lovely evening and get some rest.